Welcome back, everybody, to our third series in the Kitchen Table Conversations with the Men and Masculine Folks Network. My name is Pheng, using he and him pronouns. And this week, we're going to continue our conversation from last week, really concentrated and focused on what community accountability looks like and how we as men and masculine folks really navigate community accountability when one of our people or our male friends commit harm in community. How do we actually support the person in doing accountability, support the people who they've harmed in seeking justice as well too? And with all that's happening in the US at this moment, it's real vitally important that we really think about community accountability and justice for the survivors and the victims that people have actually harmed as well too. In addition to that, I think it's really important for us in this moment to really honor Breonna Taylor and all of the Black folks who've lost their lives to state violence, which is specifically through police brutality as well too, because of the news yesterday. And it's a shame. It's very shameful that we don't hold police officers to the standard of how we hold ordinary citizens with regards to violence, right? Because we believe it's in the course of their work and their job, and so therefore they oftentimes get away with it most of the time, I would say. And it's important in our conversation today that we take the time to make that recognition and make that honoring of all the Black folks, especially the Black folks who are trans-identified and queer-identified, who often are very invisible in these conversations around police brutality and state violence towards people of color, specifically towards Black people as well too. So taking a moment to really making that recognition, understanding that that's the work that we have to do amongst ourselves who are doing this work, however we're defining this work, and doing the work in our own local communities of engaging the men that and the masculine folks that we're engaging at the intersection of race, gender, and class, and all the other forms of oppression as well too. So I want to pass it now to all of you who are with me today again, and have you all share and remind who you are to everybody else so we can have the conversation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm super excited to be on our third call with all these amazing guys, and yeah, hopefully be able to bring a different perspective as a Latino and to keep learning new tools and learning from our experience to do a better job as men. So thank you, everybody.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ed. I use he and him pronouns. I'm here in Duluth, Minnesota, and just so excited to be back with the three of you and looking forward to the conversation.
And hey, everybody. My name is Sean. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And as everybody said, I'm glad to be back. Glad that all of you are tuning in to watch these conversations that we're having. And just as a reminder, as we're having this conversation and you're listening in, if there's any comments or questions, things that you're thinking about or worrying about, and you want to hear us chat about, please comment, on Facebook or on this YouTube video as well. We'd love to hear from all of you.
Thank you. And I think the other part is, we really want to make sure that we prep all of ourselves to be really in the conversation. And at times it looks like the four of us are having this conversation, but we really want to make sure that the questions that we're asking each other, all of you who are listening and watching to us, are also participating in answering the questions for yourself at the same time in our preparation of hopefully in the next month or so that we'll be able to do live engagements with all of you as you watch our series of kitchen table conversations, because we really want to make sure we're dialoguing and broadening and deepening the conversations that we as men and masculine folks are really having at the intersections of race, gender, and class, right? And how we navigate our manhood and masculinity in that. That being said, I want to sort of prep us to this place of like thinking back about like how we as men and boys are socialized and masculine identities are socialized to be like strong and protectors of our community and specifically of our family, right? And I think that that notion of being a protector of your family is so vitally important, you know, when we really think about community accountability and justice, right, for people who've been harmed by men and masculine folks and what that really looks like. And I think that what we've seen is, and what I've seen is that we tend to like want to jump in and start solving the problem, right? Because we've been so socialized to actually like be that protector and be that um, between person, or like go out and really beat up or go out and tackle whoever harmed our loved ones, you know. But I think in the community accountability conversations, we're not taking that away from men and masculine folks of being the protector, but how do we really think about the acts of violence that we do and participate in, right? As we're trying to protect our own families, and what does that really look like and mean? And I think that that's a critical conversation for us as men and masculine folks to really navigate. Is that, for example, if my sister were to be harmed by my brother-in-law, I would want to beat him up, right? But I have to really think through what the consequences of that really look like and what that really means in the beating him up part, right? As a man and as a protector of her. And does she even want that? Does she even need me to be showing up in that kind of a way, right? So I have to walk the line of making sure that her centering her experiences and centering her voice as well too, because me beating him up would be great. I would feel great about it, but would it help her in any way to seek the justice that she wants? And I think that that's the navigation that we as men and masculine folks really have to navigate and think about in this conversation, right? And the complexities that are involved in that. And I think that that's the starting place that I want to sort of move us on in this conversation about community accountability, because we have been, as men and masculine folks, been socialized as protectors, as strength holders of our communities and our families, and as to be like the head of our households as well too, you know. So any thoughts or ideas around that thinking and that idea, and how you yourself have really navigated that when you've seen people harmed in your own circles of support or own networks, and how do you struggle and move with that, you know, with trying to not go out and enact the violence, but yet make sure that you're also centering the person who's experienced the harm.
Well, I know for me, I think what you mentioned about the socialization piece, and how, typically men and masculine folks want to just, jump in whenever something is wrong, whenever we think something is broken and needs to be fixed. I relate strongly with that. And, even thinking about just within my relationship with my wife, Amy, and thinking about how oftentimes, when she's trying to express some harm, whether it's been, myself that has caused this, or, whatever the case may be, oftentimes my brain is just automatically going to, okay, how can I fix this for her? This person is someone that I love and care about, and I don't want to see her harmed. I don't want her to feel that way. And, for me, it's like, as soon as my brain makes that switch, then I've like sort of turned off my active listening ability, my ability to really like deeply hear, and empathize with that pain or harm or violence, whatever it is. And so for me, thinking about when I was growing up, the ways that I saw men around me acting, I mean, it was basically the role of men to make all of those final decisions, to sort of be the head of the household, to, to fix things, to be that person. And so for me, thinking about the way that, Amy and I are trying to build our marriage, we've been married just over 4.5 years now, and really trying to look at what does an equitable, equal partnership look like. So I guess that's where my brain went, just right to the personal at home part, and then trying to really think about how does that expand out then to, the neighborhood and the community and all of the people that we're connected to. If I can't practice those types of, deep listening skills, and just sitting with the pain, sitting with the harm, I'm not going to be able to do that out in community, especially when it comes to being in different types of communities, whether that's the Black community, LGBTQ plus community. There's all those nuances, but I feel like for me, it starts at home with really trying to listen and do better in that way.
Oh yeah, you really said a lot of good stuff there that I would definitely resonate with too. And I think it's important to acknowledge that men and masculine folks are oftentimes, we really are taught in a variety of ways that we should be able to fix and create resolutions and have everything, make everything okay. And that violence is sometimes part of the mix, like Pheng is talking about, when people around us are hurt. That's one of the tools that we're taught that it's okay to use. But as you were talking, Sean, I was thinking about, like, for me, one of the hardest, most difficult lessons has been that it does come when you learn that, when I learned that I have caused harm, or even that I'm just not being what's needed. Like, my responsibility to the community, my responsibility to people's well-being isn't quite what's needed. And like, you already mentioned this, but the ability to like be with that and actually pay attention to what's being said and offered, and also to be okay with that. The way to like address that sometimes is with patience or with quietness. Sometimes it involves doing things that are really uncomfortable, but it requires us to be with it requires me to be with the purpose of like what actually restores a harmony, or what actually restores a balance, what actually allows for things to flow or move in a way that that is good again. And that's really different than being like, what makes it so that everybody will say it's okay. I think that's a pretty big difference. And I think it's wise to start with the personal, and then think about how that actually does affect the way that we do this stuff in community. I mean, unfortunately, I think we all probably have experiences with people around us being harmed by people in our families, people in our communities. I haven't been perfect in how I address that by any means. But one of the things that I know has been true is that there isn't one formula for it. Sometimes it takes time before you can even get to the place where you actually understand how the person who is being harmed is experiencing what's happening, and what they actually want and what they actually need. It can be a long processes of holding people with care and with trust and with love, despite the fact that there has been harm. And sometimes people have to move really quickly to make sure that like further harm or extreme harm isn't going to happen. And that I haven't handled all of that perfectly in my own life. It's part of the configuration of questions and moments that we face. But I think that it is key, the difference between trying to get everything into a certain order where everything is okay, and actually thinking about and being focused on how is it that we pay attention to people's actual needs and restore the balance and the flow, is a real difference at a community level and at a personal level for me.
Yeah, I need to second what all you guys just share, and understand a lot of people, take advantage, of that power, how they benefit, of it. And me as a father now, that in some points of my life, I use that benefit for myself, how that harm my daughters, my wife, and what we need to do in order to get to that point that we understand how harmful that is, and as a man, what I need to do in order to avoid causing that harm. As a father of the two daughters, sometimes I can even see, in their reaction, how they expect, sometimes men to do certain things, even that I've always been really open, and I've been, doing laundry, doing things just to share with them that they, all in the whole family, we need to help each other. But we see it in those, gender roles and how that goes from generation to generation and how those men continue benefiting from it. So I think it's very important to have that conversations with our sons and daughters, so they can see how much harm it causes in our society, how we can provide more power to women and girls, so men don't need to decide, what's the best for women and girls, what are their rights, or birth rights. I mean, we see it in the government, how men are making decisions for women with the reproductive rights, and how we can change that, the importance of voting, importance of putting ourselves in their position, and to realize, that maybe not actually causing harm, but being silent, how that's part of the problem. That I see myself a lot of the times that I was one of those silent men that didn't step up just because maybe I didn't know what to do, maybe because of my insecurities, maybe because I was afraid, of making a decision that wouldn't make other men see me strong enough, and sometimes how I can use my voice, my strength to show fear and show more power, when maybe inside of me I was like, not strong enough. So I think it's very important to understand how gender roles affect to that disposition, and how men can use their privilege to cause harm consciously or unconsciously, and how as men the importance of stepping up and maybe, pulling aside those family members that are causing harm, and having a conversation with them. Maybe that wouldn't change sometimes everything, but at least you're gonna make that person conscious that there's people looking at you. There's people seeing that what you're doing is wrong, and maybe once you start thinking more about it, they can start breaking those unhealthy behaviors that cause so much harm in our society.
Yeah, I guess what we're all alluding to, and what I'm picking up is the internal pressure that we as men put on, and masculine folks put on ourselves, to be able to navigate this role as a protector and as a leader or a strength person, a manly person in our homes, and in our communities, and trying to keep the peace, quote unquote, in that way. And keeping the peace isn't through our word of mouth, oftentimes, right? We're taught oftentimes that keeping the peace is really through violence, and that's how we keep the peace as men and masculine folks, is that in order to keep the peace, that's actually what we should be doing. And so we have a steady relationship with violence as we've grown up. And people expect that, right? So people expect that that's how men should and masculine folks should behave, and therefore people are always like, "Oh, boys will just be boys," right? The typical cliche response of when boys are acting out, or when boys are fighting each other, and it's like, "Oh, they're just boys, so they're playing, and they're just going to be like that." And so I think that in that, it's a lonely struggle that men and masculine folks find themselves in, that I've noticed and seen, and we don't sometimes know how to actually best navigate that. I think the parallel that I see when we look at what Ed was sharing about community accountability, I don't know if that's where we're yet in the conversation, but yet the parallel to me is that the system that you have built around policing is really built around how we've thought about what men are supposed to be, right? So that idea and those ideas of what men should be as protectors and whatnot, we've implanted that idea into the system and into this entity, into these organizations, as police officers being protectors of community, protecting us from bad people, protecting us from anybody and everybody that's going to harm us. And we think of men in that role as well too. And to me, that's a very patriarchal practice. That's very patriarchal in terms of the culture. It's just, it looks different, right? Because now it's an entity, which is the police versus us as men, but it's a parallel track that I see in terms of the values that have shaped and helped shaped policing and what policing means. And so therefore, when Black folks are actually murdered by the police, we don't actually give too much of a crap, quote unquote, in the larger society or systems about it. The same way as when women and girls and queer folks are being killed by men, we don't pay too much attention to it, or we think that it's, the harm isn't that much, right? Or it's just normal, quote unquote. So there's a lot of parallels in that in terms of like these ideas and these notions of how we've been socialized as men and masculine folks and how we navigate that in relationship to, like, I think what Ed said very clearly about internally, myself on a very local and micro level, and then macroly, how do I show up to really do community accountability when somebody has actually created harm, or I myself have created harm, like what how do I move in that, right? There's my other thought is that there is a clear distinction for me as I've worked over the years and understood over the years is that we really have to distinguish between what is harm and then what is actually hurt, right? And I often think of hurt as something that's more internal to myself about my own values and expectations of how the world functions, right? My own rules of how men are supposed to be, masculine folks are supposed to be, how my family is supposed to be in relationship to me. If I have a value, for example, around time and everybody showed up late constantly, I would be hurt. I wasn't harmed. Nobody had harmed me in that. But I'm hurt because people showed up not valuing time, right? Because that time is something that I value. And I think that that's an example that I want to really demonstrate, because I think in seeking justice and getting community accountability, when we really think about what that means for ourselves and for the people who experience the harm or cause the harm, I think we really need to think about how do we make that distinguishment, and how are people ready to actually talk about the harm and not mix in their hurt in it, right? Because I think we've all seen or experiences and spaces and places where we've been hurt and we show up ready to heal in the harm, but we're really not, because we're still blaming, and no amount of whatever the other person is saying to us, we're like, no, we were still hurt right afterwards. And I think I don't want to dismiss that that's not real and that people can't feel that way, and people who experience harm and violence cannot have those feelings, and because those feelings are real. But it's just, again, how do we navigate that piece as well when we really think about community accountability and accountability for ourselves as men and masculine folks, right? Because on the micro level, like all of us have shared here, is that's where it starts, is that we have to learn how to be accountable to our own self first.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you said a lot of stuff that turned on light bulbs in my head for me there. And they aren't just light bulbs for the head, like they're kind of like the type of thing that makes sense for, you know, the way that I am in the world. One thing that I think about is, like, many of us, as we were sort of hitting on, we have the experience. Like, it's valuable for us to talk about this in the way that we would like to see it be, and that it should be, because that's how we chart a path to get there. And we find, like, we're raising young people, so many young people are being raised in conditions that do have a lot of actual harm and violence, and then they're trying to navigate and stay safe and help others be safe within that, and the expectations and the gender roles and all of that are mixed into this thing. So it's not, you know, many people are trying to do their best in some pretty difficult conditions, and it calls us all to think together about what we can do. And I just, as you were talking, Pheng, I was thinking about, like, within a family, if you think so, like, patriarchy is a way where men and masculine folks get, like, it's a way in which systematically we get power and we get resources and we get to decide how things is done. And if you hold things that way, and I were to decide that I'm a person who, holds that responsibility and holds that power. So someone in my family, there's a fight, people have gotten mad enough with one another, they're not talking to one another, now there's been violence. And I only see myself as, like, the person who can solve that, or the person who can intervene that, the person who can decide who's right or who's wrong. What does that do for questions like, who are the people in the family who actually, like, know these folks at the depth where they would understand what is needed at a deeper level? Who are the people that understand, like, at the greatest depth, like, how the family has solved problems in the best and most functional ways in the future? Who holds, like, spiritual and emotional knowledge within the family? Like, for instance, in my family, my grandma would have been a person who would have, like, had a lot of it was behind the scenes, but a lot of information and a lot of ways of sort of encouraging and moving things. And when we hold things, like, people play these different roles, and when we hold things like we're the equalizer, we're the decider, we're the protector alone, it cuts off so many possibilities. And, like, I was trying to acknowledge when I started that, like, it's easy to say that, and then you end up being in the situation where bad things are happening at fast paces and things like that. But if you do, like, bring it out to a community level, and we have an institution like the police that we decide, these are the people that keep us safe, these are the people who are going to decide, these are the people who have the right to use violence, these are all the, like, they're going to be the ones who maintain the order and the safety of a community. And we do that in such a way where we don't allow for the wisdom in the other pieces of community that are actually needed to actually create safety and well-being. The people who know how various communities and the communities as a whole have solved problems, the way that the belief systems work, the way that that history has impacted how things are happening, that know the people at depth, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface of the way that a community works. And instead you put, a largely, like you said, it's basically we expect it to be a male-driven sort of, like, enforcement piece into place that will solve all the problems. That's not to say that there isn't a role for somebody who helps move things when there's conflict or whatever, but it's one very blunt way of trying to handle the complexity of what's needed within a community that is related to the way in which violence and men's dominance and control over things has been reinforced over long, like, generations of time. And the light bulb hadn't quite clicked for me like that until you started talking about it, but that's definitely powerful to me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and yeah, for what you guys are sharing. But yeah, absolutely. I remember growing up and my dad being the one making the decisions in the house, and even when I knew that he was wrong, he always came to, well, this is how things are gonna get done, And for me, it was like I never felt maybe that I wasn't being heard, just because when my dad had that role of, the one in the decision is his way or the highway, even when he was wrong, maybe when he was causing harm. So it's harmful, especially for younger boys, younger girls, being in that position, like you said, Ed, is, being sure that that person who's making those decisions understand, the harm that's causing. It's very challenging, but at the same time, the society make you make decisions that most of the time, as a man, it benefit you, but don't benefit others. So yeah, it's one of those things that now as a father and how I share those responsibilities with my wife, and I'm very lucky to have an amazing, strong woman, a wife that have teach me also the same thing, that make me be sure that I take my time, and even if I make a decision that's wrong, she pull me aside and tell me, you know what, you notice this, you notice that, you notice that you're using your privilege, or maybe what I said was a microaggression. It have teach me a lot, you know, to be a better man, to be a better father, especially the two girls. And hopefully when I'm having conversation with my friends, that transmit, you know, my experiences and help them to make those decisions in their homes, and eventually how we can use that knowledge to, you know, with our communities, with our circles, to start making those changes. That it's challenging for a man, especially sometimes when your ego, to admit that something wrong, especially, you know, maybe sometimes the way that we grow up, but at the same time to be vulnerable and be a better person, you know, better man.
I'm thinking about, yeah, that piece about, you know, when I was growing up, I saw my dad make mistakes. I saw the men around me, you know, push forward with a decision that they thought was best, and then, you know, like the ramifications, it didn't work out, right? And we see that all the time. And I think even for myself too, like I'm constantly making mistakes, and thinking about like these different levels of harm too, versus you know, the idea that men and masculine people, we sort of have like a really low bar for being quote unquote like a good guy, a good father, a good husband. I was just watching a stand-up thing last night, and the comic, female comic, was talking about how, you know, it takes just this tiny little thing, and then, you know, fathers get acknowledged as being, oh, you're such a present father and you're doing all these things. And then she said, you know, and it takes the smallest thing for everyone to realize, like, or to say, hey, mom has made a mistake and you're a crappy mom, you know, just those little things. And so I'm thinking about, you know, the different levels of harm that I've caused. And also about the piece of acknowledging the harm, you know, like with all of these mistakes that I'm, you know, I think that all of us are constantly making every day. You know, I'll say something and I'm not intending to hurt my wife's feelings, but that happens. And then, you know, if we never actually stop and say, wait a minute, I was wrong, you know, I'm sorry, I recognize that this behavior is gross and harmful, then how are we actually gonna, you know, do better on these like higher levels of, you know, harm, whether that's people that we know causing that harm or ourselves, you know, whatever that is. And for me personally, you know, I've got a almost 2-year-old, and she's, you know, got big feelings and causes lots of frustration, or I should say, you know, she does things that cause me frustration. She's not the source. But oftentimes, you know, my wife and I are having conversations after the fact, you know, about how I've responded or how she's responded in frustration or in anger. And really this idea of we've got to start right from the beginning of telling our kids, like, I made a mistake. Dad was wrong. I shouldn't have yelled at you. I shouldn't have, you know, ripped this toy away from you, or whatever it is, you know, just acknowledging we're not perfect people. We're doing the best that we can. And I think when we can acknowledge it and say it out loud, then that, like, for me, it causes my brain to notice it the next time, you know. So how can I, you know, be real with my wife and my daughter about, I'm gonna make another mistake. Dad's gonna get angry again, and I'm gonna continue to make these mistakes, and I'm gonna continue to be open and stay open to seeing those mistakes and recognizing, you know, after I yelled at my kid the way that she looked at me, it was obvious, you know, that harm had been done. And so I think just for me, it's easy to shut down when that happens and be like, well, I didn't have any other way. I couldn't think of a different way to respond in that moment. When actually, like, I am capable of noticing when I'm getting to a point of like, I'm gonna, whether that's rage or whether that's, I can feel this frustration building, and now how am I going to communicate that? How am I going to act accordingly in a way where there isn't harm done, there isn't violence? Everyone can leave that situation feeling, maybe not good, but okay, and feeling like there's steps to go forward.
Yeah, I think you're so right on that, Sean. I think it ties so much into what Felix was talking about in terms of vulnerability and ego, And I think of the ego when Felix, you were talking about the ego piece. I was like, oh, we set up these men and masculine folks, and from really early on, if you were socialized as a boy, to be superheroes, to be the saviors of family, to be, the same way that we think about our frontline officers, police officers as heroes, the military people as heroes, who we honors as heroes, right? Is people who protect us from violent things, but they also use violence that's enacted as well too, but yet we honor them, right? So there's like this clash. I think there's this paradox that we're walking in as men and masculine identified folks on the micro level of like being set to be superheroes who use violence to combat violence, and that's okay, right? And then we don't teach boys and ourselves how to do that recognition, how to be vulnerable enough to be able to say, oh shit, I could have stopped myself from making that choice, right? Because violence is undoubtedly, and harm is undoubtedly, a choice that is made, that is fully made, and it isn't something that just happened, right? And I think I've learned that so clearly, not only from my own life story and my own choices that I've made in harming other people, but in the people and particularly in the men that I've worked with who've been deemed by the criminal justice system as causing harm either through domestic violence or through sexual violence, and them coming to programming with me and saying, oh, it just happened, right? It was in the moment that I just pushed her, or it was in the moment that I just hit her, right? Or it was in the moment that I sort of just choked her and strangled her, right? And but when you pan it out and you look at what happened and you walk yourself or the person through that, they start to see, and I start to see, like when we cut it down into smaller clips, it's like you're editing videos and you're now cutting it and splicing things, and now you're like, oh shit, it was in this moment, this 2 or 3 seconds before I behaved in the way, or before I did what I was going to do, that I could have made a different choice, right? If I had taken the time to slow myself down, to really recognize my feelings and my thoughts, and really should have not expected for others to know what I'm feeling, right? Because I think oftentimes, like, in my community, so much men and masculine folks, we always expect for others to care for our feelings and our thoughts, and people should just know what we're thinking and what we're feeling. So therefore, it's so totally okay when I'm like outraged, and when I'm like totally pissed off, and when my voice is really loud and I'm angry, that's completely normal, and that's completely fine, because it's like, let's not get him more upset. And I think that that's how we sort of set men and masculine folks up, and in that way is to not allow us and ourselves to not also allow ourselves to be vulnerable in that way. And then we can't set up ways to be accountable, right? Because then we feel shameful. Now I'm a shameful dad, or I'm a shameful partner because I wasn't that hero, or I wasn't that good guy, or I wasn't that good partner, or that good husband, or that good father to my kids, And so then now I'm deeply embedded in shame, and I think that that's one of the things that I've learned, that we have to create conditions. I think Mimi Kim said it yesterday best, right? If any of you looked at the Violence-Free Minnesota keynote by Mimi Kim yesterday, who's a fabulous transformational, transformative justice leader and activist and researcher. She said, we have to create the conditions that people who cause harm believe that change is possible. It can't just be for those of us who are doing this work or for the victims and survivors only, right? Because when we're really thinking about community accountability, we've got to think about transformational ways that the people in our community all thrive together. And it isn't just one population or one segment of the community that it's actually thriving, and the rest of the community is like, you're left to fend for yourself and we don't care about you. And I think that that's the system that we live in terms of patriarchy, in terms of how we have to navigate our lives as men and masculine folks in relationship to everybody and everything else.
Yeah, Ben, we live in a society that, you know, everyone want to be right. You know, you don't want to admit your mistakes. I think the same society, you know, they need to be perfect. You know, you see social media, you know, everybody's living the perfect life, when in reality it's not, you know. And sometimes admit our mistakes is really hard. That's something that really take time. But in my case, with my partner, being able to both understand how, you know, this unhealthy masculinity works, she can be sure of make me accountable when not necessarily my friends, my male friends, who let me know if I say something that's sexist or something that's not appropriate. So I think it's very important to be able to support, create a system you're surrounding that they're more healthy, in order to change that and be aware of, you know, you see commercials on TV, you know, having males in these positions of power, and how much harm that causes, you know, be more aware of that. And we've already seen a difference, you know, in our systems. We've seen women more active, you know, women taking roles that in the past don't used to be, you know, okay, you know, for women, and how we can empower them to avoid that. But for men to admit their mistakes, you know, it's hard. That's something that I still battling, you know, with, in order to be a better father, and to let my daughters know that it's okay to make mistakes. You know, that is not always right. Even when he uses power, he says, well, I'm right, you know, and that's it, you know, because it is harmful for them and for me too. So we want to be sure that they let them know that their voice is important. You know, it's okay for them to come to me and say, Daddy, you know, what you said was wrong. And for me, just like, you know, say, you know what, baby, you're right, you know. Like Sean said, you know, that is not always right. So, yeah, it's been vulnerable, and for me, that's something that it's been challenging, but it's something that I keep working every day. You know, just to be sure that, you know, my daughters see me as an ally and someone that when they're going through a hard time, they can go to Daddy and say, you know, Daddy, I've been going through this. So they feel the support, see that men are also vulnerable, and we can have conversations that maybe girls feel more comfortable talking to girls, but they also can talk to dad about it, you know, especially with relationships, you know, etc. So it's time for men to understand our role, admit, you know, what is causing harm, and create a new type of man that are more vulnerable, and, you know, more close to our feelings, and it's okay to cry, for men to cry. It's okay for men, you know, to do roles that are not typical for men, and you know, change the system. You know, I think that's something that the future generations are gonna benefit, because they're gonna be more open to talk, and it's gonna be reflected in the future laws that are applying our system. You know, communities of colors, etc. You know, so when you vote, you need to vote like, you know, like you're a man of color. You need to vote like you're part of the LGBTQ community. You need to vote like, you know, like you're homeless. You need to vote like you're a veteran. So we understand that as a community, we need to support each other. We can still live in isolated from each other, and use it just because of privilege that sometimes we all have in a certain point. We try to avoid what's going on there just because, well, it doesn't affect me, so who cares? You know, I let them deal with it because it's something less that we need to deal with. So it's very important for men to step up. You know, we're better than that, and we can do much more to for our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the superhero part of that, the setup that you were talking about, Pheng, I think falls into this too. It's like when we think about accountability at our personal and family levels, and then at the community level, the idea that we expect and enforce perfection is really hurtful. Perfection from ourselves, perfection from others, perfection across the board. It becomes even more hurtful when it's a certain group of people, you know, men and masculine folks, white folks, people with money, whatever, who are deciding what perfection is and enforcing it. But this part where we have over a long period of time gotten into the habit of believing that we need to be just what we say and what we understand we need to be, and that other people need to be exactly what they're supposed to be. That is a setup for failure and for harm oftentimes. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, there's a way that we can do that sort of hurt and harm that's just about like small micro level perfectionism. And then there's the way that it affects like the reality that people actually do make mistakes, they do cause harm, they find themselves in hard conditions, and then they do things in relationship to those conditions that cause other people harm. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens there. And how does the way that we expect people to be perfect and also like expect ourselves to be perfect at the same time actually contribute to this situation where we're willing to throw people away, we're willing to use violence, we're willing to justify away police murders and homicides, we're willing to justify incarcerating tremendous numbers of people and having you know, death and harm come from that. I think that it's related in really significant ways. But one thing that I know from myself is that you know, it has been a long journey, and it continues to be a journey to believe that that I will actually be okay if I say or do something that is, you know, racist, or it's homophobic, or it just misses the point and it actually causes residual harm. The habit that we have, for those of us who do that kind of community work that's based in equality, of believing that we should be perfect in it, or that we that we're not okay, that if we don't project that image, that means that we're not okay. That actually goes a long way towards ensuring that we're not going to have a very good relationship with ourselves, and we're not going to have a very good relationship with others. In relationships, I appreciate what you all have been talking about. I mean, when we believe that we're never going to say the wrong things, our tone of voice or our level of voice is never going to be wrong, you know, that kind of stuff. We have a responsibility to keep people safe. We have a responsibility to correct harm. Like, there are decision points in this. That's really different than also acknowledging in a bigger way that I'm going to make mistakes in this world and other people are going to make mistakes in this world. And are we going to throw ourselves out? Are we going to throw other people out if that happens? Or are we going to hold things in such a way where, like you said, Pheng, there has to be a path to repair, to being able to become whole again. And I don't know if I'm saying this, I mean, y'all inspired me. I'm not sure that I'm saying it very clearly, but that part of having a pathway to wholeness, I certainly hope for all people to be able to hold themselves in that way. And holding yourself in that way means that you have to be in relationship to the people around you and the community that you're in a way that allows for mistakes and allows for wholeness too. And I think that's where you started us in this conversation, really, Pheng, is how do we do that?
Definitely is a very nuanced, I think, conversation for us, particularly for us as men and masculine folks, because of the setup because of how we've been conditioned, because of how we've structured society to revolve around us as men and masculine folks, that everything revolves around our experiences as men and masculine folks and our experiences of how we interact with the world, right? Particularly that of white cisgender men who are heterosexual, that their experiences and those experiences matter so much. And what those folks say actually dictate how policies are driven, how the world functions, how society actually moves. But, and I know, Ed, you talk about this often, is, but when you don't see it, you don't think that you're like, the world is out to get me, right? But when you start to realize the privilege and the power that you have in that, and you start to recognize like, oh, because in this conversation, you know, the connecting thought for me is that in this conversation, it isn't, we're not saying don't be protectors of your family, of your community. How do you do it in a more, and how do you think through it in a way in which you aren't going to cause further harm, right? Or where you're not going to cause further violence, when you're not participating in the structural setup that's already at play, where you're going to gain more as a man and as a masculine identified person, right? And how are you accountable to that? Are you accountable to the people who've been impacted by that violence, who've been harmed by that violence? And I think that it's a more nuanced conversation, and it's about us as men and masculine folks sharing those ideas with each other about new practices and new ways of being, and how we have ourselves navigated those places of harm and hurt ourselves in our own lives, right? And how do we also heal in that? And it's so intersectional in terms of the conversation. And so it may seem, and it may sound like we talked nothing about accountability today, but our community accountability in this conversation. But in fact, what we did talk about was community accountability, because we needed to also be accountable as men and masculine folks in terms of our participation in the structure that's currently at play, and how do we actually create different ways of being in that structure, and how do we navigate that? And I think that that's vitally important in terms of why we have these conversations, so we can do that continuous sharing and exploration. And so I've learned a lot in this conversation about the connection of the personal accountability to that of the community accountability, to that of those who've been harmed as well. So I want to make sure all of you also share your last closing thoughts about your own learnings and reflections about this conversation. And obviously we'll continue to have the conversation in 2 weeks as well too, and want to hear from all of you who are watching and paying attention to us. Like Sean said earlier, like, what are you thinking? How are you navigating this yourself in terms of hurt and harm and accountability as a man and a masculine person in the environment that we are in at this moment?
In my case, I'm very happy of having these type of conversations, just because of when I was growing up, I never had these conversations. So I hope, you know, this space in this video, my hope is that families maybe are able to sit, you know, with their partners and their kids, listen to this conversation and start having these conversations in their circles, and sharing, you know, what they do every day, what kind of, you know, issues they go every day. So we are more vulnerable, and create a space where everybody feels safe and we're more understanding of each other. So I really hope this type of conversation is something that can, you know, start that, you know, conversation in different families, different circles, because it's very important. I never had this type of conversation till I was older. So I think I probably missed a lot of, you know, opportunities and ways to grow up maybe earlier, just because I never had this conversation. So now I'm really careful when I have this conversation with the youth and the groups that I work with, just because I see the importance of it. So thank you guys for sharing your stories, and hopefully this could be the inspiration to other people to have the conversation. We didn't have all answers, but at least it's the beginning. It's the start of something positive, something good that's gonna, from what we all gonna benefit of it.
Yeah, geez, the benefit of these conversations, you know, we are all at kitchen tables, and I wish that we were at the same kitchen table. But part of the benefit of it is just getting to learn and get to know and be with you all together, and then the way that it like makes me actually have a deeper understanding and feeling of what I understand, what I believe, the way that I am, why I am the way that I am. It's like I feel like I come to these conversations and grow as a result of them. So like, um, I'm excited about when we are able to take these conversations into a place where people can interact more, because I hope that everybody that's interacting with this is really doing what you taking the cue, Peng, to like consider these questions for ourselves too, because it's like a responsibility. You don't get to the place of figuring out these paths forward and these practices without learning and growing together in relationship, like we are. And I'm excited about who else might be in that constellation that's going to come into these kitchen tables. I think about that superhero thing in relationship to learning and growing and deepening, and just um, the reality that superheroes have, oftentimes it's for a common good, but they have power over other people because of their extraordinary strength. And I think one of my takeaways is realizing how much that actually played into the way that I saw myself as a young person, and then the way that I came into work to try to address violence against women and girls, and femme folks, and uh, and that when we see ourselves as superheroes or as people who are going to hold a different type of power, like the invitation, the thing that I'm taking out of this is like how important it is to actually just see yourself as someone who plays a role equally with others, with other components within any given community, within any given effort. And then to understand that since I'm not actually a superhero who has special powers, that the reality is that if I pretend I am, it's very difficult to actually like face and acknowledge the things that aren't quite going right in my own life, in my own contribution to people, in my own relationships, and to change those things. So I appreciate you all for sharing those lessons today.
Oh yeah, wow. It's hard to even know which, piece of this conversation to really sort of wrap up on for me, because I think so much of it hit deeply and very close to home for me. And I'm thinking about, we touched on that sort of perfectionism, expectation, and for me, whew, that's a big one. Like I've had that ingrained in me for so long. Like this is the expectation, and if you can't meet that, you're a failure. You should be ashamed. You should pull away or disconnect from community. And I think for me and many men and masculine folks, if we can sort of reframe that thinking into I'm going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. Instead of trying to sort of do this pretend, I think the superhero thing too, like, I have moments where I feel like I've got this all figured out, and then almost instantaneously something will happen, or I will say the wrong thing, or hurt happens. And so I think, for me, recognizing that is going to happen as we do this work, as we're intentionally meeting and having conversations, rather than, for me, my go-to when I mess up is to, get defensive or to pull back and isolate myself. And so, what does it look like if men and masculine folks are actually being honest about how we're doing, how we're feeling, and how we're trying to grow into these, these people that our communities need us to be, our families need us to be. Yeah, I think there's so much power and hope, and I feel excited every time that we leave these conversations, because it's just a, rejuvenating time of real talk of, what are we doing well, and how can we do better and be better for our communities. So on that note, as we've said a couple of times, we would love to hear from you. We want to know how you're doing, what questions and things you're thinking about when it comes to manhood, masculinity, and the time that we're living in right now. I mean, there's so many different stresses and anxiety out there, fear. So please comment on this. And like we mentioned, we're hoping for our next conversation to be live. So you'll be able to tune in on Facebook and comment those questions and ideas for us to discuss during our next episode. So that will be happening on October 8th at noon Central Standard Time. You can follow our page on Facebook, Men and Masculine Folks Network. We'll put that out on there. Also, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I will put a link in the description below here where you can also find previous episodes. So if you've missed any, you want to get caught up, please check out the link in the description below. And as always, thanks again for tuning in. Thanks to all of you. I appreciate all of you being in my life. And yeah, until next time.